Mm-hmm.
A full-page ad for an individual restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Whoever took that out must be nuts.
Why do you say that?
Do you know how much a full-page ad costs?
No, how much?
It costs...
For decades, fans of Bewitched have wondered why Dick York, the charming and witty original Darren Stevens, suddenly vanished from the beloved sitcom at the height of its success. One week, he was there trading magical banter with Elizabeth Montgomery's Samantha. The next, he was gone, replaced without explanation. Rumors swirled for years. Was it a contract dispute, jealousy, or backstage drama? But now, after years of silence, those closest to York have revealed the heartbreaking truth behind his sudden departure, and it's far more tragic than anyone ever imagined. Behind his warm smile and comedic timing, Dick York was fighting a private battle that few on set truly understood. It all began years before Bewitched, during the filming of They Came to Cordura, when a freak on-set accident left him with a torn back muscle and chronic, excruciating pain. Despite the agony, York pushed through, determined not to let it derail his rising career. But as the pain worsened, the painkillers followed, and with them came a dependence that would quietly consume his health and his career. By the late 1960s, Bewitched had become one of the most popular shows on television. But behind the laughter, York was collapsing between takes, sometimes unable to stand, sometimes fighting through tears just to deliver his lines. His family watched helplessly as he struggled to keep going, unwilling to let go of the role that had made him a household name. Then one day during filming, he collapsed on set, and that was the moment everything changed. Now, after years of speculation, York's family has spoken out about what really happened, revealing the toll that injury, pain, and Hollywood pressure took on his body and spirit. Their account finally brings to light the real reason he walked away from Bewitched, not by choice, but by necessity, in a heartbreaking fight to survive. In the 1960s, Bewitched wasn't just another TV sitcom, it was a national obsession. Millions tuned in weekly to watch the magical misadventures of Samantha Stevens, the charming witch who tried to live a normal suburban life. And right beside her was Darren Stevens, the mortal husband who tried his best to keep up with her spells, chaos, and quirky in-laws. Played by Dick York, Darren was sarcastic yet lovable, nervous yet devoted, the perfect counterbalance to Elizabeth Montgomery's serene Samantha. Together, they created television magic. But in early 1969, fans noticed something strange. After 5 seasons, Dick York suddenly disappeared from the show with no explanation. The next time Bewitched aired, Darren was still there. But he wasn't Dick York anymore. Instead, another actor, Dick Sargent, had stepped into the role as if nothing had changed. The scripts continued as usual, the laugh track rolled on, and the producers hoped no one would notice. But audiences did. Letters poured into ABC asking what had happened to the real Darren Stevens. Behind the scenes, however, the truth was far from ordinary. For years, Dick York had been quietly battling something that no one in Hollywood could see, a pain so relentless it shaped every hour of his day. Long before he ever set foot on the Bewitched set, York had suffered a catastrophic back injury that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It happened in 1959. On the set of They Came to Cordura, a film starring Gary Cooper and Rita Hayworth. During a demanding railroad scene, York and several other actors had to pump a heavy handcar down a track. In one disastrous moment, the physical strain tore muscles in his back. York later described it vividly. "The muscles on the right side of my back just tore. They snapped and let loose." The pain was immediate and permanent. Though he tried to shrug it off at the time, the injury left him with chronic pain that no therapy, medication, or rest could fully relieve. Still, York was determined to continue his career. He was too proud, too ambitious, and too optimistic to quit. Over the next few years, he appeared in numerous television shows, masking his pain with a smile. But by the time Bewitched came along in 1964, the injury had become a shadow that followed him everywhere. The show's producers adored him, describing him as funny, professional, and endlessly kind. Yet they soon noticed that York was often pale, sweating, or trembling between scenes. To manage the agony, he began taking prescription painkillers, first occasionally, then daily, then constantly. What started as medical necessity turned into quiet dependence. The pills allowed him to work but stole his energy, clouded his mind, and left him trapped in a vicious cycle. Some days he could barely make it to set. Other days he would perform brilliantly, only to collapse afterward in his trailer. The Bewitched crew did everything they could to help. They built a special board in York's dressing room so he could lie flat between takes. Directors scheduled his scenes in short bursts. Co-star Elizabeth Montgomery was patient and caring, often visiting him when he was too weak to move. But as the seasons went on, his body grew weaker. York's family, his wife Joan and their children, watched helplessly. They knew how much he loved his craft, how hard he was fighting to keep up appearances. But the cost was becoming unbearable. He was in constant pain, Joan later admitted. Every movement hurt him, but he didn't want to let anyone down. By the 5th season, the situation had reached its breaking point. During the filming of an episode in 1969, York was delivering his lines when suddenly he felt a searing pain shoot through his spine. Moments later, he collapsed in front of the crew. He was rushed to the hospital where doctors ordered him to stop working immediately. That episode marked his final appearance on Bewitched. He never returned. Without warning, the studio quietly replaced him, pretending as if nothing had changed. But those who knew the truth, his family, his castmates, and his friends, understood that Dick York hadn't walked away because he wanted to. He left because he couldn't survive the pain any longer. When the cameras rolled, Dick York became the perfect suburban husband, funny, frustrated, and endlessly patient with his witchy wife, Samantha. His charm seemed effortless, his timing flawless. But when the lights dimmed and the laughter faded, he was a man at war with his own body. What no one in the audience saw was the quiet agony behind those bright blue eyes, an agony that followed him from set to set, day after day. York's back injury, suffered a decade earlier, had never truly healed. By the mid-1960s, the pain was constant, sharp, and unrelenting. Simple movements, standing, sitting, bending, became ordeals. Yet instead of slowing down, York pushed harder. He had a wife and 5 children to support, and Bewitched had finally given him the fame and stability he had dreamed of for years. He refused to let anything take that away. At first, doctors prescribed him painkillers, a mix of codeine, muscle relaxants, and sleeping pills to help him cope through long shooting days. What began as a medical necessity soon turned into a desperate dependency. He needed the pills not just to work, but to function. "If I took enough, I could get through a scene," York later admitted. "If I didn't, the pain would paralyze me." But the more he took, the worse the side effects became. He would drift in and out of focus, his energy drained, his emotions unstable. On set, his co-stars began to notice subtle changes, moments where his expression faltered, or his lines came out slower than usual. Still, York fought on, determined not to let anyone know how bad things had gotten. Director William Asher and Elizabeth Montgomery did everything they could to protect him. The production team often rearranged the shooting schedule so York could rest between scenes. A special padded board was built for him behind the set, where he would lie flat between takes, his face pale with exhaustion. Sometimes he'd have to record entire scenes lying down, with the camera carefully angled to hide it. Despite the accommodations, the pressure never let up. Bewitched was a major network success, and every delay cost money. York's illness caused more and more interruptions, and though his co-stars adored him, the studio executives began to lose patience. Television, after all, was a business, and sympathy could only stretch so far when millions of dollars were at stake. His wife, Joan, became his anchor. At home, she managed the household, cared for the children, and quietly nursed her husband through bouts of pain and exhaustion. But she could see the toll the medication was taking. York would often sit in silence for hours, distant and dazed. "It wasn't that he wanted the drugs," Joan once said. "He just didn't know how to live without them anymore. He wanted to keep working. That's all he ever wanted." There were good days, too, moments when his humor returned, when he'd walk onto the set cracking jokes and making everyone laugh. On those days, Elizabeth Montgomery said, "He was like sunshine. You could feel the warmth in the room when he was around." But those moments became rarer with each season. By the start of 1969, York was living on the edge of collapse. His pain had intensified, his medication intake had increased, and his body was losing the battle. During the filming of the episode Daddy Does His Thing, the breaking point finally came. York was standing under hot studio lights, reciting his lines, when he suddenly turned pale. A moment later, he crumpled to the floor unconscious. Crew members rushed to his aid, and an ambulance was called immediately. He never returned to the set again. That day, according to York himself, was the worst day of my life. At the hospital, doctors warned him that continuing in that condition could cause permanent paralysis, or worse. It was the end of his career as Darren Stevens, though no one officially. For Dick York, it was the beginning of a different kind of struggle, one that would test his will, his family, and his very sense of identity. The charming TV husband everyone loved had vanished, replaced by a man learning to survive away from the spotlight, fighting pain, poverty, and addiction all at once. When Dick York left Bewitched in 1969, the decision wasn't publicized, explained, or even properly acknowledged. One week, audiences saw him as Darren Stevens, frazzled but lovable, yelling "Sam!" as magical chaos unfolded. The next, he was gone. For the viewers, it was confusing. For York, it was devastating. The set that had once been filled with laughter and applause now existed only in memory, and the role that had defined his career had slipped away without a goodbye. His final day on set replayed in his mind over and over. He remembered the collapse, the voices calling his name, the blur of studio lights as everything went dark. When he woke up in the hospital, his wife Joan was there holding his hand. The doctors told him bluntly he couldn't return to the kind of physical work television required. His back injury, compounded by years of strain and dependency on painkillers, had reached an irreversible stage. The damage was done. At first, York didn't want to believe it. He convinced himself he'd recover in a few months and return to Hollywood stronger than ever. But as weeks turned into months, the phone stopped ringing. The industry had moved on. The producers of Bewitched didn't call, the studio offered no assistance, and his fellow actors, though sympathetic, were powerless to help. By 1970, Dick York's once bright career had gone completely silent. The financial strain was brutal. Without steady work, York's family struggled to make ends meet. His savings dwindled quickly and medical bills piled up. Joan took on part-time work to keep food on the table while also caring for her husband, whose condition worsened by the year. York's dependency on pain medication deepened during this time, not out of desire, but desperation. It was the only way he could endure the constant pain radiating from his back and neck. Still, he refused to surrender to bitterness. Friends who visited him during those years described a man who, despite everything, kept his sense of humor alive. He could barely stand, but he'd still crack jokes, one friend recalled. He had this light about him. Even in pain, he found a reason to smile. In interviews years later, York spoke candidly about his downfall. "I lost everything, my health, my career, my savings," he said. "But I didn't lose my faith in people. You can't live with hate in your heart. It'll eat you alive." Throughout the 1970s, York's attempts at recovery were slow and painful. He spent most of his time at home, often confined to bed. Acting offers were non-existent. Hollywood had labeled him unreliable, a risk no studio wanted to take. His once celebrated face had faded from TV screens, replaced by younger stars and newer shows. By the early 1980s, York's situation had grown dire. He and Joan were living in poverty in Michigan, surviving on minimal income and donations from friends. Yet even then, York found purpose again, not as an actor but as a humanitarian. Despite his physical limitations, he began volunteering his time and voice to help the homeless and the poor. He started a small organization called Acting for Life, where he used his connections to raise funds and awareness for people in need. Working from a telephone in his modest home, he would call strangers, charities, and churches, asking for support for those less fortunate. In his own words, "I was flat on my back, but I still had a phone and a voice. That was enough." Those who knew him during this period described him as deeply spiritual, reflective, and gentle. The same man who once made millions laugh was now finding meaning in compassion and service. Though his body was broken, his heart remained strong. York occasionally gave interviews in his later years, sharing his story honestly but without resentment. He admitted his addiction, his regrets, and his pain. But he always circled back to gratitude. "I had the best years of my life on Bewitched," he once said. "And even though it ended the way it did, I got to make people happy. That's what matters." By the time the 1980s ended, Dick York had faded from Hollywood's memory. But those who truly knew him never forgot his courage. He was no longer the face of a magical sitcom. He was a man who had faced unimaginable loss and still found the strength to care for others. By the late 1980s, Dick York's body was failing, but his spirit remained unbroken. Years of living with chronic pain and the toll of addiction had left him frail and dependent on oxygen to breathe. Yet those closest to him recall that even in those final years, he radiated warmth, humor, and an unshakable faith in kindness. Though Hollywood had long forgotten his name, York continued to inspire everyone who crossed his path, not through fame, but through his quiet courage. He spent his last years in a modest home in Rockford, Michigan, far from the bright lights of Los Angeles. The once vibrant star of Bewitched now lived a simple life with his wife, Joan, by his side. Confined mostly to bed, he relied on an oxygen tank to ease his labored breathing. But even from that bed, he remained active, making phone calls for his charity, acting for life, and raising money for families who had lost everything. Friends often said that York gave more to others when he had nothing left to give himself. His wife became his full-time caregiver, and together they faced every hardship with quiet dignity. "He never complained," Joan later recalled. "Even when the pain was terrible, he'd just smile and ask how everyone else was doing." Their love story, which had endured decades of poverty and illness, was a testament to devotion. "Joan was his lifeline," said one family friend. She was the one who kept him going when everything else fell apart. By 1991, York's health had deteriorated significantly. His back injury, compounded by emphysema from years of smoking, left him in constant discomfort. Yet even then, he remained optimistic. In one of his last interviews, he said, "I've had a full life. Pain can't destroy love. It can't destroy laughter. As long as you can still laugh, you're alive." On February 20, 1992, Dick York passed away at the age of 63. His death was quiet, no headlines, no fanfare, just the gentle ending of a life marked by struggle and grace. But in the days that followed, his family finally decided to share the truth the world had never fully known, the real reason behind his departure from Bewitched, and the private battles he had endured afterward. For decades, speculation had painted York's exit as unprofessional or mysterious. Some assumed he had been fired. Others believed he'd quit in anger. But his family wanted people to understand that the truth was far more human and far more heartbreaking. They revealed that York's departure was never about conflict or ego. It was about survival. His 1959 injury had never healed, and by 1969, the pain had become unbearable. The medication that allowed him to perform had slowly taken over his life, leaving him physically and emotionally drained. "He didn't leave Bewitched because he wanted to," Joan explained. "He left because he couldn't stand or walk anymore. His body just gave out." His children echoed those words, describing their father as a man of extraordinary kindness who never let bitterness consume him. "Dad wasn't angry about losing fame," one of his sons said in an interview years later. He was grateful for the time he had. He loved that show. He loved Elizabeth Montgomery, and he loved making people laugh. That's what mattered to him. Elizabeth Montgomery herself would later express deep affection for her former co-star. "Dick York was a wonderful man," she once said. "Working with him was a joy. I wish things could have been different for him." In the years since his passing, fans have come to see York's story as one of quiet heroism. A reminder that behind every smiling face on screen, there may be battles the world never sees. His family's honesty finally gave closure to the mystery that had lingered for so long. They revealed not a scandal or secret feud, but the simple, Painful truth of a man who gave everything he had to his craft until his body could give no more. Dick York's legacy isn't just tied to Bewitched, it's tied to his humanity, his resilience, and his ability to keep believing in goodness, even when life tested him most. As his wife Joan once said, he may have left Bewitched, but he never stopped believing in magic, the kind that lives inside kind hearts.